watching Republic.
Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. You're watching 6 Stories at 6, the Sunday edition of the show with me, Tanisha Avasthi. Let's get started with the stories that have set the agenda for today. Our major focus, ladies and gentlemen, will be on what's happening between the United States and Venezuela. First, we will break it down for you on why exactly was Venezuela attacked by Donald Trump. Next, we will break down the pictures that United States had released showing Maduro in their custody. He had been handcuffed, he was changed. Also on the show is the exclusive ground report on how Venezuela looks like right now as Republic has its presence in the country. Also on the show is a detailed report on what awaits Venezuela next after the dramatic fall of Maduro. Meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, there is also discontent that is growing within the United States over Donald Trump's move to attack Venezuela. And back here in India, one story that we thought we should focus and tell our viewers is about how there is a demand for pure water. A similar case like that of Indore has surfaced in Gandhinagar, where there is a case of contaminated water case. 140 people have been hospitalized. 6 stories on the show, moving first of all with our top agenda story. The United States launched military strikes on Venezuela yesterday, capturing President Nicolás Maduro and triggering global shockwaves. Donald Trump claims Maduro enabled drug trafficking networks threatening American lives, a claim which has been completely decimated by Venezuela. Now, the impact on Venezuela's massive oil reserves have, of course, been showcased. The largest global is also under scrutiny. We explain why exactly United States attacked Venezuela.
U.S. forces air and ground operations in and around Caracas. Capture of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro marked the most dramatic U.S. intervention in Latin America in decades. The White House said the action was aimed at national security. President Donald Trump accused the Maduro government of turning Venezuela into a narco state that enabled drug trafficking networks threatening American lives.
The illegitimate dictator Maduro was the kingpin of a vast criminal network responsible for trafficking colossal amounts of deadly and illicit drugs into the United States.
However, here is the key point. Drug trafficking into the U.S. originates from multiple Latin American countries, including Mexico, Colombia, and parts of Central America. So why did Venezuela alone face direct military action? U.S. officials say Venezuela stood apart because of direct allegations against the state itself. Washington argues that Venezuelan leaders were actively protecting traffickers, shielding criminal networks, and repeatedly defying U.S. indictments, elevating the issue from drug enforcement to a national security threat. However, oil is another critical dimension. Venezuela holds the largest proven crude oil reserves in the world, a resource largely underutilized due to sanctions and mismanagement and years of economic collapse.
Venezuela holds the world's largest oil reserves, known to be about 300 billion barrels, and it's a strategic unfolding of events which we have to watch in the coming days. Russia and China are geographically very far. Russia has been entrenched with its own war with Ukraine, and China has openly not come in support of Venezuela.
Venezuela sits on an oil giant, reserves of 300 billion barrels, but one in deep decline, current output being a fraction of the total capacity. US officials argue that stabilizing Venezuela could help restore oil production and reduce global supply pressures. Critics, however, countered that this blurs the line between security intervention and strategic resource interests. President Trump has been explicit about the oil angle.
As everyone knows, the oil business in Venezuela has been a bust, a total bust, for a long period of time. They were pumping almost nothing by comparison to what they could have been pumping and what could have taken place. We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money.
Washington maintains that existing indictments and criminal charges against Maduro provided grounds for action. International law experts, however, question whether criminal warrants alone justify cross-border military force. In Washington, opinion is divided. Supporters call it a decisive action against organized crime, while critics question the absence of congressional authorization. Inside Venezuela, pro-Maduro groups denounce the strikes as an illegal invasion. Globally, reactions have been mixed, with some governments condemning the action outright, others urging restraint. With the US shifting from sanctions and pressure to direct intervention, key questions remain. Will this intervention curb drug trafficking, stabilize Venezuela, and restore democratic governance, or trigger prolonged instability and backlash across Latin America? And also, how will this reshape control, ownership, and access to Venezuela's crude reserves?
Ladies and gentlemen, Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro has been captured by the United States forces in a dramatic overnight operation and is now facing trial in the United States on charges of narco-terrorism. Maduro, who was taken into custody along with his wife, is being held in a New York detention center as he awaits trial in New York. The operation, which was carried out by United States Special Forces, has sent shockwaves around the world. Here's a report on the initial images that had just crept into our newsrooms of Maduro being brought to New York, where he has been shown handcuffed, he has been shown changed, and what was his initial reaction.
Blindfolded, carrying a bottle of water in his hands, this is the Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, now in US custody.
The illegitimate dictator Maduro was the kingpin of a vast criminal network responsible for trafficking colossal amounts of deadly and illicit drugs into the United States. As alleged in the indictment, he personally oversaw the vicious cartel known as Cartel de las Solas. Maduro and his wife will soon face the full might of American justice and stand trial on American soil.
US President Donald Trump himself shared the image of Nicolás Maduro, captured en route to US onboard American warship. Handcuffed and surrounded, these were the initial visuals of Maduro when he landed on the American soil. Amid high, intensive security, he was brought to US onboard warship USS Iwo Jima. Nicolás Maduro is now kept in a New York detention center as he awaits trial. Nicolás Maduro and his wife Celia Flores were captured following a massive US strike on Venezuela. The duo, along with Venezuela, now looks forward to uncertainty as they will now be put to trial on charges of narco-terror. US strikes on Saturday were another watershed for the American continent, a dramatic upturn of events watched closely by global diplomatic circles.
The fallout of the massive United States strike on Venezuela is now being felt far beyond the blast zones. In Maracaibo, Zulia state in Venezuela, fear and uncertainty are driving people to the streets. There are long queues, empty roads, and tightened security that have painted a picture of a city that is bracing for what may come next. This even as Washington hints at further action. Insights straight away from the city on your screens.
The aftermath of massive US strikes and apprehended leadership has pushed the Venezuela into deep uncertainty.
Since we know about helicopters flying over Caracas and bombed 7 different parts of the capital city, here in Maracaibo, it's the second city, the most important here in Venezuela. The people go out of your house and buy medicines, food, gasoline.
In Maracaibo, panic buying has begun. Gas stations across the city are overcrowded. Large stretches of the city remain quiet as fear grips daily movement. Security has been tightened across the region.
Outside of the capital Caracas, like here in the western city of Mérida, life is generally calm. As you can see, the square behind me is largely empty. Most Venezuelans are currently in their homes or glued to social media to find out what will happen after the illegal US bombing of the capital Caracas in the early hours of this morning.
The regional government is set to hold a meeting concerning situation ahead.
These are the people who will now be looking at these developments in Caracas, and maybe while condemning the attacks by the US government against Venezuelan sovereignty, against international law, they will also be looking with a little bit of hope to see if this brings the sort of changes that they wish to see for a better Venezuela.
Concerns have intensified after Trump hinted at a possible second wave of attacks on Venezuela. The fear is rooted in what residents have already witnessed. Back in Maracaibo, uncertainty dominates. For many, the question remains, what does tomorrow look like?
United States has struck Venezuela, it has captured the president, and now what's next? After capturing of the president, Nicolás Maduro, the country's future is now being shaped far beyond its borders. With Trump administration openly asserting control over the transition process, global diplomacy in motion and competing power centers emerging at home, the question, ladies and gentlemen, really is no longer what happened, but what awaits Venezuela next. Now, the Vice President of Venezuela has taken over. Marco Rubio yesterday in a late-night call had spoken to the Vice President of Venezuela. What was the discussion all about and what is going to be the future of Venezuela? Here are the details in this report.
Venezuela has entered an uncharted territory. For the first time in decades, the country's political future is being directly influenced by external power, marking a dramatic shift in how Venezuela may be governed in the months ahead. US President Donald Trump has announced that Washington will administer Venezuela during a transition period.
We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. So we don't want to be involved with having somebody else get in and we have the same situation that we had for the last long period of years. So we are going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. And it has to be judicious because that's what we're all about.
The US says the objective is clear: prevent chaos and safeguard energy assets. Critics warn this approach risks being seen as external control rather than international support. Number of nations around the world have condemned the use of force against a sovereign country and its president. The international response is now accelerating. An emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council is scheduled for tomorrow, where the legality, scope, and duration of US involvement will come under sharp scrutiny. Inside Venezuela, authority remains contested. The establishment has appointed Vice President Delcy Rodriguez as the interim president, rejecting US stewardship and asserting domestic constitutional continuity. Amid the churn, the attention is also firmly on opposition leader and Nobel laureate Maria Corina Machado. Seen by many as a unifying democratic figure, her stance on US involvement and her next moves could shape elections, negotiations, and national reconciliation. The key question now: can a US-led transition produce stability without triggering nationalist backlash? And can Venezuelan political forces coalesce around a roadmap that leads to elections?
The political party of Maduro continues to be in power, the military remains in power, and the military remains supportive of the Maduro regime. So a regime change which America wanted has not yet happened, but in the coming days it could happen that people in Venezuela come out in the streets protesting, maybe celebrating the downfall of Maduro. There would be definitely a period of extreme turmoil in Venezuela in the coming days and weeks.
What happens next will ripple across Latin America, affecting migration, oil markets, and regional power dynamics, while also redefining how global powers intervene in failing states. For millions of Venezuelans, this moment carries cautious hope. Whether it becomes a turning point towards recovery or another chapter of uncertainty will be decided in the days and weeks ahead.
And well, yes, the United States President Donald Trump on Saturday, that is just yesterday, had announced the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, a move that was possibly brewing from alongside the closed doors, making another watershed moment in the history of two American continents. The move is also being opposed internally. We do know that this wasn't an overnight operation, ladies and gentlemen. It was a planned move by the United States. The United States, just remember, just earlier last year, it was in November and December when the United States had already struck Venezuelan boats where the United States had claimed and accused Venezuela of drug trafficking. However, this was a claim that was completely dismissed by Venezuela, saying that it is because that Venezuela is rich in Venezuelan oil. That is exactly why Donald Trump wants to capture it. Two different claims that had come to light, but the end result is Venezuela is now in the custody, has now been captured by the United States. And while all of this is happening, remember, there are voices of dissent that are growing inside the United States against the move that has been pushed forward by the United States President Donald Trump. Here's why.
At my direction, the United States Armed Forces conducted an extraordinary military operation in the capital of Venezuela. Overwhelming American military power, air, land, and sea, was used to launch a spectacular assault. And it was an assault like people have not seen since World War II.
Donald Trump on Saturday announced a successful military strike and the capture of the Venezuelan president Nicolás Maduro. And while Trump pats his back for the move, it is being met with the protests inside the US itself. Venezuelan President Maduro will be put to trial in the Southern District of New York. But New York is also where protests were held at the Times Square against the US military strikes on Venezuela. Protesters also took to streets in Washington, D.C.
I believe that military interventions are inherently dangerous, and Trump lies and the State Department lies. They lie in their reports on Venezuela. And I think it's to impose our will like this, it's cowardly, and it's disrespectful, and it's dangerous.
This invasion of Venezuela has everything to do with trying to distract us from him being in the Epstein file and the crappy state of our economy and the rising healthcare costs.
The US strikes on Venezuela have reportedly led to 40 casualties, with Venezuelan officials as well as civilians dead in the operation. The protests at Times Square demanded investment in jobs and education, not in war. Recently sworn New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani also took to social media condemning the US action. Mamdani called the attack unilateral and an act of war that violates international and federal law. The protesters in Washington, D.C. echoed the sentiment as well.
I just stand against U.S. imperialism altogether. U.S. imperialism, they want oil. Like the U.S. wants oil, they want to help their corporate billionaires. Bombing is just their means to building power like that, you know, to taking control. So again, I'm against it.
Former Vice President of US and Democrat Kamala Harris criticized the Trump's move. 7 leak points in the newly laid water supply network has been formed. Sewage mixing with drinking water turning tap water into poison. A 30-bed typhoid ward has been opened at Gandhinagar Civil Hospital. Gandhinagar Municipal Corporation has also formed 40 different teams. House-to-house service underway, water samples being tested, leakages now being traced, but only after the damage is done. Deputy Chief Minister Harsh Sanghvi visited the hospital, reviewed arrangements and issued directions to officials. From Indore to Gandhinagar, the pattern is disturbingly familiar. Contaminated water, an outbreak that could have been prevented, and accountability that comes only after lives are put at risk. So the question is, why does clean water basics still remains a luxury? Aren't we paid taxes on this? Think about this.
And with that, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for us to slip into a short break, but don't go anywhere. News and updates continue. This is all that we could pack in this edition of 6 Stories at 6. We will be back same time tomorrow getting you more agenda-setting news. Coming up is live and breaking after a quick break.